Is this on? Can you hear me?
On the other one.
That's it. Well, thank you for inviting me to your community. It's an honor to be here. I do live just down the road in the town of Ulysses. So fracking is this form of fossil fuel extraction that really turns the earth inside out. It buries a surface resource that is vital to life, namely fresh water, and brings to the surface subterranean substances, hydrocarbons, radioactive materials that I want to get into, heavy metals, and brine, which represent ancient seawater, that were once locked away in deep geological strata, and now, once they're brought to the surface, now they require permanent containment. And all of those, that exchange of water for gas creates health risks at every stage of the process, and that's what I want to get into. I've been researching as a biologist all these health effects for the last 2 years or so. I spent 20 years in the field of public health, and I've had to learn a lot of geology in order to do it. And I'm not licensed as a biologist. I don't know why biologists aren't licensed, but I'm not under oath, unlike Tony. So I'm going to invite Dr. Ingraffea to correct me if I make any geological errors. So before it is sent down the borehole, the fresh water that is used to fracture bedrock is mixed with a lot of inherently toxic materials. And these include some known and suspected carcinogens, that means chemicals that cause cancer. Also in the fracking fluid are neurological toxicants, including brain poisons, and chemicals that are actually linked to pregnancy loss, so-called reproductive toxicants. There are also, at least to carry all that water and all those chemicals to the wellhead, there's at least 1,000 truck trips required just to frack a single well. Remember, there are multiple wells on a pad, and you remember all those spacing units that you saw. So our rural roads then will be filled with fleets and fleets of 18-wheelers hauling water and this toxic material. So these trucks, along with earth-moving equipment and compressors and condensers, also release a lot of air pollution, and that creates soot. These VOCs, that stands for volatile organic compounds, those are the very vaporous chemicals like benzene, toluene, the so-called BTEX chemicals that are also come up with the gas from under the ground. And exposure to this kind of air pollution has demonstrable links to things like childhood asthma in children, and in adults, stroke and heart attack, lung and bladder cancers, and in pregnant women, preterm birth. And preterm birth is actually the leading cause of disability in this nation, and probably the most expensive medical thing you can have happen to you, because it costs millions of dollars to take these tiny babies born too soon, up to their due date, and then very often they have lifelong medical problems and educational problems that require millions upon millions of dollars of intervention over the life of that individual. So that's kind of an overview of all the kind of various things I want to explore with you now in a little more detail tonight. And it's a story, admittedly, about which there are many, many uncertainties. So we don't have absolute proof for a lot of different things. So the question I actually want to raise with you tonight is, what level of safety do you want? Do you want to know that there is just an inkling of evidence that fracking will damage our community health, or do we want absolute proof of that? And is the default to go forward until we can demonstrate that we're being harmed, or do we ask the industry to show us that almost certainly no one will be hurt before we say yes? And so I think this is really the question of our age, the question of our time, is how much risk and uncertainty we decide as a community that we're ready to tolerate. Now I want to really get into the health effects, and I'm going to start with the shale and how it was formed. So I'm going to take you back, and as Dr. Ingraffea points out, this is a landscape that we can't see. Nobody's actually gone down there and walked around on this bedrock, the Marcellus, that underlies us here. But I wanted to kind of take you down there imaginatively and point out that the shale below our feet, this Marcellus shale, was formed about 400 million years ago, when this whole area was a shallow ocean. And this ocean had no name because there was nobody with language alive 400 million years ago. In fact, the creatures who lived in this ocean had no backbones, they had no lungs, they had no fur or scales or three-chambered hearts. They were mostly sea lilies and squid and a lot of plankton. The east coast of this ocean would have been around where the Catskill Mountains are now. The west coast would have been in northeast Ohio. The southern coast is on the bottom of West Virginia, and we would be on the northern coast up here in the Finger Lakes. So the water in this ocean had a lot less oxygen than water does now. There wasn't enough, the plants in the earth hadn't kind of gone on photosynthesizing for as long as they have. And so therefore, when these sea lilies and squid died, their bodies didn't decompose the way animals do now when they sank to the bottom of the ocean. Instead, they turned into bubbles of methane, which is carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, right? And that's a gas. And so their bodies became this gas. So when we think of fossils, we tend to think of bony things that we can actually see in the rock, like skeletal things. But fossil fuel refers to basically three kinds of things. One is coal, which is lumpy and hard, right? And that is actually vegetation, so that's fossilized plants. And then there's oil, and animals are very oily, fatty creatures, and so when animals die and there's not enough oxygen to decompose them, they turn into oil, or in this particular case, the vaporous form of petroleum is called natural gas. So that the vaporous froth, the kind that evaporates very quickly, that's natural gas, that's methane. However, those creatures don't just turn into methane. They also can turn into lots of other hydrocarbons that are also vapors. And some of those would be things like butane, ethane, benzene, toluene, and all kinds of other stuff, even formaldehyde. So all of that vaporous stuff also got trapped down there in the silt. And then, over millions of years and lots of pressure, all of that stuff hardened and fossilized and turned into these layers that you saw in the beautiful picture of Together Park, turned into shale. How did I do? Is that right? Good. All right, so imagine then this layer of bedrock beneath us, the Marcellus, with this kind of petrified fizz of champagne bubbles trapped within it. That's those bubbles that the gas industry is after. Now, there are also bubbles that are giant bubbles that were trapped because tiny bubbles traveled through naturally occurring fissures, and then they got trapped somewhere in giant pockets. That's the natural gas that we are running out of. The giant bubbles that are trapped, that you can get by simply putting a cocktail straw down in the ground and intersecting that giant bubble, and up it comes without a lot of trouble. We've basically run through that already. So now we have to go after the teeny tiny bubbles that are this petrified fizz of stuff that you have to blow the rock up to get out, and that is what requires fracking. All right, now the shale turns out not only to be an ancient graveyard of fossils, but it's also a living ecosystem. There are still creatures that are alive today that are living on the shale and running their lives and altering their habitat to suit themselves. So the shale is like a subterranean coral reef, and the organisms that live down there include bacteria, but also this relic domain of life called archaea. And so while I've been researching this stuff, the place to go to see archaea, since you can't go down a mile here to take a look, is to go out to Yellowstone National Park and take a look in the geyser basins, because that's a place where the magma of the earth is close enough to the surface that all these creatures that normally live very far below in this 40-degree Celsius temperature, which is like bath water, right? Like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They're now present at the surface, and they form very complex systems. They can create colonies, they can create fan-like shapes and sheets. They can actually send nanowires out. This is a little message for you biochemists out there, if there are any. They can send nanowires across themselves out into the surrounding rock substrate and to send electrons out to control oxidative stress. They can't do electron transport. So they send their electrons out to the rock, and they're actually altering the rock when they do that. And so it's really these living creatures that are kind of making and remaking, recreating the rock that down below our feet. So the message here is that the earth is alive, right? The old thinking is that this substrate below our feet is kind of dead, inert, right? That's no longer true. Geologists actually believe that the deep life contained in these deep geological strata by biomass outweighs all of us here on the sunlit surface of the Earth. In other words, the biosphere, the living part of the Earth, extends much further into the deep part of the planet than we knew or really appreciated 30 years ago or so. And they're very weird creatures. Some of them run on radioactive decay, some of them have arsenic in their DNA, and some of them can feed on some of the hydrocarbons that are down there, and so on. So they're very different from we are. So why am I making a big deal about them? Well, because they have to be killed off to make the gas flow out. And that's one reason that fracking is so toxic and has possible effects for our health. So one of the ingredients in fracking fluid are biocides, very powerful pesticides. Some of them like glutaraldehyde are some of the most powerful poisons I know about. And they can basically kill off anything that they touch. Because when you run those laterals down there, surrounded by all their casings, they have a borehole, right, that the gas is going to flow up, but these organisms will live there. They'll, like barnacles on a sunken ship, they'll just kind of take over and colonize it, and eventually interfere with the flow of gas. So one of the additives to the water that's used to fracture the shale are these very powerful poisons. Essentially what we're doing is conducting a subterranean version of aerial pesticide spraying. And so one of the reasons we get very concerned about the flow back of fracking fluid is because what comes back up also contains these very powerful poisons. Okay, so with that, then let's kind of back up and take a look at the whole process of fracking. Hydrofracking, of course, refers to water, and we think a lot about water as the club that's used to smash the shale apart, and that's true. But in a sense, the water is simply the delivery system for what really is going to do the job, which is silica sand. So if you simply fracture all the shale down there and expect the gas to flow out, you need almost 10,000 pounds per square inch of pressure to exert on that water to break the rock up. As soon as you release that pressure, the lithostatic pressure of the Earth, just the weight of the Earth, is going to close those cracks back up. So you need to use the water to shove sand grains into the cracks, into those fractures, to hold them open so the gas bubbles can flow out. And once those sand grains are in there, they're in there forever, right? And you've propped open the stony jars forevermore. Those sand grains aren't coming out until all the gas, the gas is just going to be, it's just an open doorway now, forevermore. You can't use any kind of sand grain. You need silica sand because that's the Samson of sand grains. It won't crumble with the lithostatic pressure of the Earth pushing down on it. So one risk for fracking is from the silica sand, which itself is a carcinogen. It's mined in the place in the world where I come from, which is rural Illinois, along the Illinois River. From there north into Wisconsin and Minnesota, it's being turned into vast strip lines where silica sand from underground sandstone is being mined out, filling the air with silica dust, and then put into rail cars and brought here. Some of it is already being stored near Horseheads, which has become a staging ground now of operations for fracking that's taking place in Pennsylvania. And so silica dust is then unloaded from the rail cars, and the sand is unloaded, it turns into dust. This is I want to make a big point about the sand because it is one of the biggest occupational threats for workers. So this is one reason why these kind of jobs that are touted in the oil and gas industry are not jobs I would ever want my own children to have. These are killing jobs. Not only do fracking jobs have terrible accident risks. So in other words, if you look at the CDC data, the chance of being killed on the job as an oil and gas industry worker is 7 times that of other comparable industries. More than twice that of a police officer. So in other words, if you're the mother of a young guy who works in the oil and gas field, you have to pray twice as hard that your son's going to come home as the mother of a police officer, right? And that's just from things like head injuries and vehicular accidents. Added on top of that is that they're breathing in silica dust that is so concentrated that even dust masks can't adequately protect them. When you inhale silica dust, it triggers a couple things. One is lung cancer. Another is a disease called silicosis, which is a kind of autoimmune disease. And what's interesting about silicosis is that the risk continues after the exposure ends. So you might only work for a few months on the job and then get laid off or quit. But this silicosis can occur and it's progressive. In other words, the exposure ends, but your lungs, the business end of your lungs, end up filling up with fibrous, they become fibrous nodules, and you can't get oxygen across them anymore. And you can become disabled very quickly as a fairly young person. And the question then remains, well, what about us who's not working in the industry? What if we just live near a place where all these well pads are and silica dust is going into the air? Is there enough silica dust to affect, let's say, a pregnant woman or children who are living in a school near where fracking operations are taking place? And I, as a biologist, cannot give you any data on that because we have never exposed the general population to silica dust before. I can tell you, what are the risks to a sandblaster for being exposed to certain amounts of silica, over a certain amount of time. But we have no idea about how much silica is safe for a pregnant woman or for a child. Because normally silica dust is not something you're ever exposed to unless you work in the sand industry. And therefore there's just no data. And unfortunately in Wisconsin, the no data has been translated to mean no evidence of harm, and therefore no regulations. And so you can go to places in Wisconsin and see this kind of dust kind of hanging in the air in rural areas, residential areas where people live, far from the gas well, but nobody knows whether or not those limits are safe for the people who live there. So one of my concerns about opening up our area to fracking is not only water contamination, which I'll get into in a minute, but also what it means for silica dust exposure and the failure of us in the public health community to be able to say, well, here's the limits that we know are safe for children, for older people with emphysema, for a pregnant woman, and so forth. We simply have no data to offer on that question, so it's a complete unknown. So let's continue talking about air for a little bit. Each one of us, every time we inhale, we breathe in a pint of atmosphere with every breath. Breathing is our most ecological act. So it's the part of our environment, the air that we take inside of ourselves over and over and over again all day long. In addition to silica, one of the things we worry about is traffic. It's simply old-fashioned traffic exhaust, especially diesel exhaust. Our housing stock here in upstate New York is fairly old, especially in rural areas. It's located very close to our roads because in horse and buggy days we didn't want to get snowed in. And so you have some of our homes built very close to roadways. And we know, we do have some good data showing that diesel exhaust it is very, very bad for us. And we know exactly how bad it is at what increment, in other words, increments of badness uptick increments of certain kind of health problems. We mentioned preterm labor. That's the big danger for pregnant women. Also, small for date babies who are born on time, but they're small. They also face health problems. And then we know for in older people that kind of air pollution is associated with stroke and heart attack risk. And in older women, we have new data now showing that it's related to cognitive decline. In other words, if you're an older person and you're living near a busy roadway and breathing crummy air, that's the equivalent of aging your brain by about 2 years. So you have more rapid cognitive decline, the more roadway pollution you're breathing. We know for children who live and go to school near busy roadways, they have trouble learning and trouble sleeping. And academic performance goes down. So this, in other words, affects not only our immediate health, but also the academic achievement of our children as well. All right, so let's jump to water. We are all 65% water by weight, and we have an intimate relationship with our public drinking water supplies or our rural well. After air, drinking water is our next most ecological act. I brought some water from my own drinking water well in Trumansburg, and I'll just do the simplest thing here and just take a drink as part of the performance here. So this water, and this comes right out of my kitchen tap, which comes from the municipal water in the village of Trumansburg, which is located in a well right near the Boy Scout camp down near Teganic State Park, which is downhill from everything else in the town of Ulysses, right? In this water, according to the water utility, which is now required by EPA to report to us annually drinking water contaminants found in our water, this water has in it nitrates, which almost certainly come from synthetic fertilizer from all the agriculture that we practice in the town of Ulysses. Ironically enough, anhydrous ammonia fertilizer is all made from natural gas, so the nitrate in here has its start with natural gas. It's not high enough to be a violation, but it's concerning because what it shows is that there's a pathway between the surface of the earth and the drinking water table, because chemicals used at the surface have gotten in here. So in other words, it's a vulnerable aquifer. And we know that because geologically it's called an unconsolidated aquifer, meaning there's no sort of stony lid on the top of it. It's just kind of open and porous. It's like having a sieve instead of a lid on the top of your water. We also know that there are high levels of trihalomethanes in this water, meaning when we chlorinate it, there's a source of carbon that creates things like chloroform and so forth. This is also within the legal limits, but it also indicates this water is not exactly pristine to start with. Nevertheless, it's pretty good water, and I'm now going to take a drink. And within about 15 or 20 minutes, by the time we're done here tonight, what I just drank, that groundwater deep below the earth next to Cayuga Lake, will become my cerebral spinal fluid and my blood plasma, and some of it I will exhale as the steam of my exhaled breath. So it's in the process now of becoming me, and whatever contaminants are in that water now become part of who I am. I'll set aside some of the issues around water contamination to hear what your concerns are. I think Dr. Ingraffea touched on them pretty well in talking about how well casings leak and how those volatile organics that are naturally occurring down in the shale, if you create portals of contamination between the shale and the drinking water aquifers that lay below, there are portals, there are pathways by which not only methane, but benzene, toluene, and so forth can find their way into our water. I'm going to close now by talking about food. And for this, I just pulled some things out of my own refrigerator that my children enjoy. One of them is grape juice from Glendale Farm. Of course, I could have brought a bottle of wine as well. Obviously, grapes are something that is a big part of our local economy. Grapevines are very sensitive to ozone. They don't grow very well with ground level ozone. It's an air pollutant associated with fracking, and it causes grapevines to grow more slowly. So there's a real concern for our grape industry. Here's what's left of the loaf of bread we have in our house. This is from Wide Awake Bakery. This bread is grown in fields with heirloom wheat that is actually milled in my town of Trumansburg. There's a miller, and then there's the baker. Wide Awake Bakery, Stefan Senders, turns that into loaves of bread that I can buy locally that are also sold in Brooklyn. Wide Awake Bakery and the miller and the farmers who grow this, I think some of this is actually grown in Caroline, am I right? Yeah. So it kind of connects this whole region. Those farmers would like to expand their operations. This bread is hard to come by. I mean, there's literally a bread line out the door in Trumansburg when they distribute it every week. And you only get one, and you try to actually slip them some money and buy some more, and you have to check your name off the list. It's very precious. Why is there not more bread? Well, they would like to expand their operations because demand is high, but the land around them is all leased up to the gas industry. And so already we've seen, even before drilling starts, the competition between energy extraction and actually growing food. And so it becomes a question for us as to which, what we want, because in some cases, it's a real choice. You can't have both. And lastly, of course, is our dairy industry, represented in my household by, let's see, some Gouda cheese, made right in Trumansburg from farmstead cheese from Mecklenburg. This one's called Skylar Gouda. That's a favorite. And then Chobani yogurt, which my daughter says is actually man yogurt. No girl eats Chobani, only boys eat Chobani. That's based on a middle school sample size of about 12, so I commend that to your further research. Chobani, of course, is one of our state's major big national, international companies. It was the proud sponsor of the Olympics. I think we all felt some pride when we saw that. And the cows, of course, that are producing the milk for both this cheese and this yogurt are living and eating and drinking and breathing in the fields that could or won't be turned into well pads. Mammalian milk is highly sensitive to chemical contamination. In fact, when we are interested to know what people are exposed to, the first thing we do when we go into a community to test community exposures is to try to get a sample of mother's milk. Not because mother's milk is so more contaminated than anything else about us people, but it's a good stand-in for what's in the rest of us. It's a very sensitive medium. It's the canary in the coal mine. And that's true for all milk, including those of cows. We know that when the Fukushima disaster happened in Japan, within a few weeks you could actually measure the radioactive isotopes in the cows of Vermont. That's how sensitive it is. That's how long distance the travel is. So I'll conclude here by saying that it's not just chemical contamination we worry about with fracking, it's also radiation exposure. That down there in the shale was deposited 400 million years ago, not only dead sea creatures, but also radioactive elements from a mountain range that used to exist where the Catskill Mountains are now. That mountain range entirely eroded into the ocean that used to be here. Mountain ranges contain inside them a whole periodic chart of elements, including a lot of radioactive things such as uranium, which can decay into radon, and radium-226. Those are very different kinds of radiation. Radon has a half-life of only 3 days. Radium-226, I think about 1,600 years. But they both are unearthed and come up with gas. They're in the flowback fluid, and they're, in the case of radon, it's in the gas itself. So here's what I want to conclude with. We all know what natural gas is. We all know the familiar whoosh when the furnace kicks on. We know the blue flame under our stove and so forth, and it looks the same as it's always been since we were little kids. But the source of the gas matters. If our gas is now coming to us via fracking, it contains stuff in it that the old kind of gas we got through vertical drilling doesn't. And one of those things is radon, which is not destroyed in the process of combustion. Radon is the leading cause of non-smokers' lung cancer, and the #2 cause of lung cancer overall. So the question is whether or not by creating an infrastructure that brings into people's homes fracked gas, if we are not increasing into our homes radon, which is something we know even before we fracture the shale, we worry about anyway. So even with an unfractured bedrock, it finds its way up into our basements. It's something we think about and have to mitigate. What kind of problem will we have if we blow apart our bedrock and let this radon escape in our gas and perhaps through other means? Do we have absolute proof that will cause harm? We don't, because we've never blown up our bedrock before. This is an experiment that we've never conducted. But we do know that fracked gas contains radon. We're in the process now of trying to understand what the health effects are. The question is, do you want answers to those questions before or after you say yes or no to allowing fracking in New York? Thank you very much.